Hi, everybody. So I'm going to go ahead. We're going to start our meeting. I call this meeting to order. I'd like to call the February 2nd, 2022 meeting of the Special Education Advisory Committee. I do want to recognize that we are hosting this meeting on unceded Algonquin territory, and I'd like to thank the Algonquin people for letting us host our meeting this evening. I'd like to call a mover for the approval of the agenda that is listed. I need a mover. Thank you, Kathy. Does anybody have any changes or additions to the agenda this evening? Okay, all those in favor? Perfect, passed, carried. So I'm just gonna let you know also that I will be calling a 10-minute break after our presentation this evening on finances. I'm not going to say 8:30 because it could be before, it could be after. So as soon as after our presentation, I will go ahead and call our break. There's no delegations this evening, and I will move ahead with the review of our Ciac report. So there were no amendments that were brought forward in advance of the meeting. I'd like to call a mover to receive the Ciac report of the 5th of January 2022. I need a mover. Thank you, Kathy. And all those in favor? Perfect, thank you. Carried. So we're gonna go 4.2, our forward agenda, just so that you get us a few minutes to look over it. That is for your information package. The forward agenda is also what we go over at every agenda prep. We make sure we go through it. We make sure that we take in what was discussed at our meetings and where we can put them in our agenda prep. So we are on track. And moving on to 5.0, I'd like to welcome. Yes.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure
I just wanted to highlight Superintendent Farish and Superintendent Brady are both here with us observing tonight, but not on the agenda. I just wanted you to know and that they're here to take in the conversation as well.
Wonderful, thank you, welcome. And tonight's our presentation will be our Chief Finance Officer, Mike Carson. Thank you for joining us this evening, Mike. The floor is yours.
Sorry, Sonia, you skipped over the forward agenda.
No, that is there for your information. But is there anything that you'd like us to add to it?
I didn't see anything about my questions about the de-streaming that Trustee Boothby had asked to be on all of the agendas.
We did discuss it at our agenda prep. Peter?
So we were in the middle of responding in writing, as had been the request via memo. And then some other things got in the way, namely PPM 81 that we found out about last week that was coming. So we intend to have a memo to respond for our next SEAC meeting. Hopefully we can meet those deadlines because it was we got a fair bit done, but we can also take the other requests back to agenda planning.
Thank you, Peter.
All good? Perfect. And welcome Chief Finance Officer Mike to second time to discuss with us our budget overview for 2022 and 23 for our funding discussion.
Thanks very much. And I'm joined this evening by Terry Adamthwaite. Terry is a member of our finance team, and some of you will have met her in previous years. Terry has swapped jobs in finance this year. And while I'm not good at titles, she's moved over more from the financial reporting role to the budget side. And she will be working very closely with Kevin Gardner and our other staff and superintendents as we build the coming budget. So Terry's here with us as well this evening. Just before I get into my part, I do want to say to the members of SEAC, because I don't get here that often, we really do appreciate the time and the effort and the thought that you put in as members of this committee. I know for many of you, it's not just volunteer work, it's a true labor of love and commitment. And I think it's fair to say over the years that as a whole, we've made better decisions because of that. Doesn't mean that when Ciac asks me questions or makes recommendations that we can always do all of it, or sometimes even some of it, but we do value that input. So tonight I am going to try to make sure we leave some space to hear from you people directly. But I did want to start out by saying thanks for that effort and commitment. It's great to know that our kids and our schools are supported by such a group. So I'll jump right into it. I think you saw the memo that's been distributed. Item A on the agenda, and you'll have to excuse me, I am lousy at screen sharing because then I lose sight of who I'm speaking with. So if I could ask you to turn to your agenda. Item A is our comparative summary of Spec Ed revenues. And what's important about that is that it identifies those revenues in the budget that are provided separately for special education and, in fact, are enveloped. That means those dollars cannot be used for other purposes. It hasn't happened in my time, and that goes back almost 25 years. But in the event we ever underspent the special education funding in 1 year, that amount would be carried forward the next year and added to that year's existing funding. So it was designed to protect that funding, recognizing it's given to us for specific purposes. We receive, there's a number of categories of funding, which I think we've discussed in the past. The board website does have links to a number of documents provided by the Ministry of Education. Some of them are actually quite good in terms of, if you get past some of the salesmanship and the marketing, some of them are actually quite good though in helping to understand the technicalities of the funding. The largest portion of our special education funding comes in what is called the SEPA, and it's a per capita amount of funding. We receive dollars for every student in the board, and that goes towards special education. In our case, for the year we're in right now, 2021-22, we estimated that the SEPA would be close to $60 million. The total funding that is allocated to special education in the budget is approximately $125 million. That's a significant portion when you think that the entire board's budget is right around $1 billion, give or take. It means that 12% is identified to provide specific additional supports to students with special needs. We worked through this, and those of you, again, who were part of previous budget debates will know there has been concern expressed from time to time by the Ministry of Education in the past when we overspend the funding that has been provided for special education. For the coming year, 2021-2022, the year we're in, that overspending was approximately $10 million, or a little bit less than 8% of what our funding is. I can tell you that in the past, when we've talked to the Ministry of Education staff, when we've negotiated with them, we know there are a number of boards across the province where that, whether you call it overspending or underfunding, we know boards are in a situation where that number comes close to 15%, sometimes 20%. And so we as staff felt that the budget that was approved was a prudent step. We know that the needs are there in our system. 21-22 was also tricky because of the variety of issues arising out of the pandemic. And we wanted to make sure in setting the budget that regardless of what additional funding might come in specific to COVID, we would have those dollars available for to support our kids. The next chart, which is the comparative summary of our expenses, I think it's important to understand where our money is going. Almost more than half of the total special education expenses relate to teaching salaries. It's about $67 million. Our EAs are another 48 million. All of our commitment really is on the personnel side. Sometimes we lose track of the fact that we have over 600 full-time equivalent teachers assigned to specially support students. And that's those classes that are in our specialized classes. Our teachers are that are in the teaching, coaching, supporting. And so we have been able to support kids in that manner. Education assistants, I think last year, for the current year, we budgeted close to 800 education assistants, full-time equivalents. I know that as the year goes on, we quite often will overspend that amount. Historically, if demand and the nature of the needs of the kids required it, Peter and his staff would come forward with a request to provide additional dollars to allow the hiring of additional EAs on a term basis or on a short-term basis. This year, and I'm sure you've heard it from your schools, you've probably heard it from Superintendent Simmons, one of the challenges that we have, not just in our EA cadre, in our teaching cadre, across the board, there is a national labor shortage, and we are feeling those same effects. And as a result, this is a year, and I say it sometimes and people don't really believe me. This year, our problem isn't necessarily money, it's getting the people to fill those positions. And that is an ongoing task and challenge. So we are monitoring these statements on the, I know that Superintendent Simmons has come forward with a couple of short-term requests to supplement spending to the end of the year, the end of the school year, to support kids, recognizing that if there are dollars we can't spend in one area, we should be using them to support kids in different means. Those are, important decisions that we make as a senior team. They recognize there are a range of responses, and we are fortunate to be in a situation where the board's policies allow staff to make some of those reallocations of dollars on the fly, and they don't need to come back to the board unless they are in excess of $500,000 or I think it's 10% of the line item in the budget. But we appreciate the trust that the board provides in us, and in return, we do our best to make sure that we can deliver improved services with that. One of the categories you'll see is our professional staff, psychologists, social workers, our speech and language paths. That is an area that, again, as a school district, we are fortunate. We're able to budget for nearly 90 of those staff. And as recently as 2019-20, that number had gotten down into the 70s. We have been able to support those positions. Again, this is one where the nature of the workforce is such that we quite often need extra time to hire those folks and to retain them. But it continues to be an area where we are focused on serving our special education students specifically. And then there is a portion of some of those salaries that gets charged to the general budget, recognizing that they are also supporting students other than just those with exceptionalities. I think the final thing I wanted to say is that our special education expenses have been on a trajectory of growing. There, from time to time, our school district has tried to understand, will that growth slow down? What's driving it? And I think since about 2010, we added something like 30 ASD classes at the elementary panel. Not sure of the exact number. We know that as those classes were created in response to the demand for those services. We knew we would then have to be looking at added support in the secondary panel as those children age through, and we're seeing that now. That will continue to be a cost pressure. From a staff point of view, we are advocating on a weekly basis with the ministry, looking for more realistic information in the calculation of some of the specific grants. The SEPA is a provincial grant. It's the same amount for every student in the province, but there are other grants that are to be based on local conditions. And if you've, I'm looking around the room, I'm not sure I see any of the members of the previous finance committee that used to work with Ciac, but the ministry introduced a fairly complicated formula that looked at local factors such as population, the demographics, single families, economics, education, and coming out of that was a local factor. We have long argued that because of the problems with the census over the last 10 years, that those numbers are outdated and that they do not truly represent the additional demands that we see here in the city of Ottawa, nor do they represent the additional demands in our school district, where we will occasionally see very high needs students coming to our board because we're the only ones that can provide the service they require. So from a staff point of view, we continue to make that argument. We raised it through the Ontario Public School Boards Association, the Trustee Association. They raised it in their consultation with the ministry. I don't know that we will see huge changes there in the coming year. We know that the ministry and the government recognize the huge mental health issues that all of our children are facing as a result of this coming into the up to the second anniversary of the pandemic. And we believe we will see continued financial support there. But we want to make sure that we do not lose sight of the ongoing needs of our students, some of whom are our most vulnerable. What I wanted to do this evening, though, was to make sure we had time to hear from you about where some of the pressures that you feel for service or that you've seen for service that you would like Peter and his staff to consider in their financial presentations with us. The way the budget process works from here, we've had preliminary budget discussions with the superintendents. They've gone to their staff to talk about changes in service, changes in demand, how they're going to respond. We take advantage of the information that we receive, whether it's through minutes, whether it's through your motions, or whether it's simply Peter and I getting together after the SEAC meeting to hear what are those issues that are coming to the fore for you. And so we do have a pretty good background of information. We are also trying to make sure that the dollars can support activities that will help us achieve the goals outlined in our strategic plan. So it is a complex situation. On the other hand, close to 2/3 of our budget is really restricted and governed by either our collective agreements or the Ministry of Education's requirements for class sizes. The bulk of our staffing, of our teaching staffing, is governed by that. And that decision on academic staffing is normally made in the month of March. That timeline allows us to then take the overall large number of staff, begin to allocate them school by school, and it allows the process of staffing to unfold. And in a perfect world, staff know before the end of June where they'll be working by September. It puts some pressure on us. Normally, we don't receive the information from the province until April. The last couple of years, it's been extremely challenging. 2 years ago, we didn't receive the information until the 29th of June. That was the year that you'll recall the budget was approved at the end of August. Last year, we got bits and pieces of it through the months of March and April, and we were able to have a budget approved prior to the end of June. This year, The ministry, as always, is indicating they are working hard to provide us with the information required. I have a feeling, just based on the discussions and some of the message we received, we will not receive one large overall grant announcement. We may receive it in a couple of stages. Part of that is the continued uncertainty about what September might look like in terms of a COVID response. And secondly, what steps the government might choose to take as we come out of COVID with overall financial policy. The one thing that I rely on in this coming year is that it is an election year. We have a provincial election in June. I would anticipate that we will get information sooner rather than later. And while I don't expect to see us receiving huge gobs of new money, I am optimistic, hopeful, whatever word you want to use, that we will not be seeing reductions. Doesn't mean that it still isn't a difficult budget year, but it does mean that we are hoping to be able to provide a budget that, while it may not see a huge number of improvements or brand new investments, we would hope that we can minimize any service reductions as much as possible. So I'm sorry for sort of wandering on, Chair. I don't know if Pete wants to add anything about the budget process from their department's point of view. And then, as I said, Terry and I would be pleased to answer any questions that members might have or to hear suggestions.
Thank you very much, Mike. And certainly from my perspective as Superintendent of Learning Support Services, as Mike alluded to, the superintendents and the senior team, director and associate director, do get together and have discussions around various priorities. So it is helpful for me to hear from Ciac directly, so that when I'm in a position to be able to express a view, that I have Ciac's view behind me as well, informing our decisions moving forward. It doesn't mean that we can do everything, as Mike alluded to, but it is certainly helpful in shaping us, and really is one of the key responsibilities of Ciac to help provide that advice and guidance from your association perspectives. So one of the things that we were hoping to do was break out into breakout rooms for that discussion. And I have a question that was distributed to the members ahead of time to facilitate that discussion in breakout rooms. But I'm wondering, before we get there, if there are any questions on a more general nature around the budget before we get to talking about the question that we shared around themes. So, all right, we have some questions.
Yeah, I've got Trustee Boothby, Trustee Campbell, and Trustee Ellis.
Thanks. I always have questions. Thanks for that information. And you did answer a couple of my questions, Mike, with your preamble. So one of the concerns that I have when I look at the revenues portion of this, and I know that the revenue fluctuates with our average daily enrollment. And so I'm looking at both the SEPA and the DSENA amount. And I'm just curious, when we look at the 3 years that you presented, and so we started at 100,000 for total special education grants in the 2019-20 year, and now we're up to barely $1 million more, not even $1 million more for the approved budget for this current year. And my biggest question is, we all know that, as we can see in the spreadsheets, and you pointed out, a significant amount of the money in the special education budget is being used for staffing costs. And we also know that the collective bargaining agreements have given staff 1% over the years. Are we even keeping pace like, is there any allowance in here, and maybe this is a rhetorical question, for for inflation costs, not only in wages, but also in just overall costs of everything are more expensive now?
Thanks, Chair. On the revenue side, it really is driven by enrollment, and our board-wide enrollment did drop significantly in 2020-21. There were some revenue guarantees that the province provided, not necessarily all of it part of special education. And so for 2021-2022, we did budget for a very slight increase in enrollment. The actual increase has been larger than we had anticipated. And there's a report that will go forward to audit committee, I guess, later this month, and then to the board, identifying that our enrollment has been higher than we had estimated. That will roll out into higher amounts of dollars. But yes, it's, you know, we have had lower board-wide enrollment. That has an impact, direct impact on special education funding. There's no doubt about it. And that continues to be the discussion that we have with the ministry, is that an increase in funding related to the incidence of need is something that has to be part of this puzzle. Years and years ago, the province moved to try to put more money into SEPA simply because the workload and the paperwork that we were doing to justify some of the funding meant that for the month of September and October, too many of our staff were engaged in doing that paperwork. So we have to find where we're going. It's one of the reasons, looking at that revenue amount, why we as staff recommended a budget that was showing that over expenditure. We will continue to have those discussions with the province, but I don't see us ending up in a situation where the grants are increased enough to allow the revenue to fully cover our expenses in special education anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. And one of the other observations I made in that nice little Ontario publication, the Guide to the Special Education Grant, it shows in there, and maybe this is a question more for Peter, it shows in there that the identified number of students with and without IPRCs province-wide is 9.3%. Am I reading that correctly? Because we have over 21% in our board.
So I am not familiar with the statistic you're pointing to, but I can tell you, but there are varied practices board by board. Some boards IPRC everybody, and other districts don't IPRC anybody, and others are somewhere in the middle. We're in the middle in terms of IPRCing students. I thought our percentage was in the neighborhood of 15 to 17% for people with IEPs, but I don't know what our percentage is for students with IPRCs off the top of my head. Okay,
thank you. My next question is, and maybe you did sort of answer this, CFO Carson, is, do we know, so we have in the part of our revenues, we have those PPF, priorities and partnership funds. Do we know yet if we are not going to get some of those that we have been getting?
I think the short answer is we do know, and I think we are receiving. I look to Pete just to confirm, but I don't think we lost any. And in fact, there were a couple of new ones that were established, and we are working our way through to see what the benefit of those are. So those supports are continuing.
Okay, thank you.
What I'd add to that is, for example, we were able to run the continuity of mental health supports over last summer based on a PPF. So looking forward, we're not sure if those PPFs will renew.
Okay, good to know. Okay, and my last question is, when we look on the expenses sheet under the operating budget, which is very small compared to our staffing budget. Glad to see that. But I'm wondering, the second line item there is specialized equipment for students. And so I guess my interpretation of that is we're not being funded for that through either the SEA or the SIP allocations. And I'm just curious, why is that? Or have we just chosen in our model to spend differently?
Thanks, Mike. System Principal Hannah may want to jump in here, but with the SEA guideline, there are two pieces. One is the computer or technology side, and the other is the equipment piece. We are responsible for, I believe, the first $800 of the equipment side, not the technology side. So the province, for example, if we buy a piece of equipment that's $1,000, the OCDSB is responsible for the first 800 and is able to claim 200 for that. So that's where that additional funds would be coming from. Did I capture that right, Amy?
Okay, so we're spending $1 million in what I'm going to call a deductible for SEA. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Trustee Boothby. Trustee Campbell?
Thank you very much. One general question, then I think just a quick little one. I'll save the rest for input to priorities when we get that in groups, I guess. But and that is, if I could be reminded, and maybe just for maybe others' benefit, just make sure everybody's on the same page. Are there does this budget? I suspect it doesn't, but that's my question. Capture all significant mental health services and supports, or are there significant mental health services and supports which exist outside of the special education budget?
There is a for the purposes of reporting to the province and doing this enveloping that we're showing, we do have to carve out a portion of mainly our professionals' time that's devoted to supporting mental health in students who do not have specialized identification. And so there are additional dollars. I can say we do it on the basis of allocations and some assumptions about the percentage of workload. But that has been an ongoing practice over the last probably 10 to 15 years to try to get that number in place to make sure that we are not overstating the demands on the special education funds themselves. So it is one of those things in the board budget binder that is difficult to sometimes explain. You will see a greater number of full-time equivalents shown in the Department of LSS than are actually charged to the Spec Ed envelope.
Okay, so just so I understand that, I appreciate the description of things. So this does not capture all the mental health support spending, what we see here in the appendices. Okay, great. And just it's a wee question. Can I be reminded again, it's just an explanatory thing, what the 200K for the SRO transition supports were from I guess a Spec Ed perspective. I have to say, I'm sure it was explained, but I don't recall it from last year.
Peter?
I am going to have to take a look at that just to confirm. I have two different thoughts in mind, and I'm not sure which one is the accurate one. So I will get that to you.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's it for now.
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. Trustee Ellis?
Thank you. I'm probably going to ask a question that's not going to be answerable, but I've always been, Trustee Campbell spoke about the Spec Ed, and mental health, but I'm wondering if there's any way for us to understand the budgetary implications or difference between those expenses that are sort of for IPRCs and that grouping of students, which is the smaller, as opposed to the IEP, and how much of the Spec Ed sort of expenses supports students with an IEP but without an IPRC? Anyone want to take a shot at that?
Chair, I can start and then Pete can help. We've never gone to that kind of a breakdown. I guess you could take a look at it if you make some, again, broad assumptions about students with an IPRC and look at the cost of specialized classes alone. That would be a starting point. Not all of the other expenses are tagged the same way. I'll be frank, I don't know that, because of all the assumptions involved, I'm not sure how accurate it would be. It would depend on what decision we were trying to make that it was based on, if the trustee could help.
I've been advocating for years about an evaluation of the IEP. When we did, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm just trying to get an understanding, not only of the financial implications of IEPs and we take a look at that, but I would hope that when you take a look at the budget, there's actually some, but I guess that's a conversation for another day. You've answered my question. Thank you.
I think, but what it reminds me of is that as we put together the budget package itself, I can't, let us just take a look. It's not a bad suggestion. I'm just not sure we can get there this year, but it's, as I said, recognizing all of the caveats around the assumptions, we might be able to do something. I'd have to work through it with Terry and Kevin Gardner and with Peter.
I'd echo the piece around the assumptions, and I'm not sure, for example, how we would navigate an LST who's pulled a group for Empower, and some are IPRC'd and some are not IPRC'd, but all are on an IEP. So we'd have to put our heads together to think that one through.
I guess, as I said, we'll think about it. It's not it's a fair suggestion. I just don't know that we have the horsepower to get it done this year, but we'll take a look.
Thank you. Are there any other?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say if there were any other questions at this time, and if not, then we're going to go ahead and move on to our breakout rooms. And Lee has put down in our chat the question, and I'm just going to say it out loud as well, is that when we do go into our breakout rooms, that please consider the following question. From your association's perspective and your involvement on SEAC, identify 3 reoccurring themes to be considered in the development of the 2022-2023 budget. And I believe you've got staff, right, that will take us into our breakout room? Okay.
Yes. So we do have people describe. What I'm hoping for through this exercise is to help us identify what are the things that we need to focus on addressing. So rather than focusing on specific requests like an additional job class, what is the issue that we're trying to address through that? Because sometimes what happens is in our discussions, a specific request comes out and it may not be the most appropriate or most effective way of meeting that need. And if we can help identify by themes what the recurring themes are, that will help us identify, okay, so here's the theme. How might we look at doing that? How might we reprofile or reallocate existing resources? How might it be fitting in with within the existing LSS complement? The committee will be aware that over the years we have added consistently various staff. You know, we added the CDAs, the communication disorder assistants. That we have a couple of those. We've added to our PSSP staff and so on, our learning support consultants. So we have added people. But what we would find helpful as an LSS leadership is to understand a little bit more about what are the themes from Ciac's perspective. So of course, we will have our own perspective, but we would like to be able to have conversations around incorporating what are the things that continue to emerge from a Ciac perspective. So we're going to break out into groups. I believe, is it about 15 minutes, Sonia?
Yes, and also
About
just to
15.
remind, yeah, 15 minutes. I just wanted to quickly, before we go into our breakout room, that when we do come back, our discussions will be presented per group.
So one of the things when you get back is that we will be sharing amongst the larger group, maybe the top 2 or 3 themes that come out of the conversations. And then we can have a final follow-up conversation should there be any. But I think that from my perspective, that would help inform our decisions in moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Who's in charge of putting us in our breakout room, Peter?
I believe Lee is. And people are going now.
Okay. I believe this is our group.
Right, one group does stay in the main group.
Okay.
Thank you for reminding me.
The last time I've always been pushed to the other groups. I'm like, okay. And our facilitator for this group is?
I'm definitely your note taker / facilitator, but we do have the illustrious Superintendent Simmons in this group. So would you prefer to facilitate, Peter?
I'm fine with you taking the lead on this one. I may jump around,
Okay.
but certainly want to hear from the different groups.
Thank you, Peter. So kindly, the question that we've been asked to consider was placed in the chat and was read for you this evening. Just to resurface that, we are asking Ciac to comment on their perspective, and based on your involvement in Ciac, identify 3 reoccurring themes to be considered in the development of the 2022-2023 budget. And with that, I am quickly going to stop talking so that you can share your perspectives. And at the same time, I'm going to do my best to capture our group's thinking so that we can share that with the larger group. Who is our brave soul? Oh, excellent. Christine.
Oh, thanks. I'll break the ice then. I've got 2 significant concerns. So we're coming off COVID, hopefully by September of next year, but we've basically had a good 2.5 years of disruption, and it's been even bigger disruption for kids with special needs. So what I would like to see, and I'm very concerned about, is how we're going to have the capacity, both with, and I'll use an old-fashioned term that maybe was only ever used in the States when I went to school 150 years ago. And we actually used to have certain things called teaching assistants. And so what I'm concerned about is we're just asking, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're just asking teachers to be able to evaluate what the gaps or what kind of catching up children need to have after this 2.5 years, because we're trying to do that this year, but we're being disrupted again this year. So I'm really concerned that we are asking teachers not only to do the full evaluation of where children are in relationship to what their class is, but then we're also having them have to be able to catch these children up. So in terms of academics, I'm very concerned about that, because if kids miss certain building block things, it's going to take years for them to catch up. And while they're trying to catch up, their self-esteem is going down. I mean, we know there's all kinds of mental health repercussions. And so my second ask is, we also know, we don't have a conversation, and I don't have an email from a parent where I don't hear about all the detrimental effects on kids' mental health. And we only have, I think the number was 28 social workers for 73,000 children and families, essentially. I'm really concerned that we need a surge capacity in that, and I'm not sure if that can be social workers, psychologists, whatever that mix is. But we have a lot of kids who are suffering and their families are suffering, and we're just going to see an explosion of need for that. So even if we just have a temporary influx of that, and a temporary influx of people to help teachers evaluate and get kids back to their academic equivalent, or whatever the right word is for that. But those are the two things that keep me up at night. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I've done my best to note that. I'll move on.
See Maggie's hand?
I do. I was just going to pass it over to Maggie.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to stay in the background, Peter, don't worry. I don't think anybody's going to be very surprised at the list that comes from the Learning Disabilities Association, but I will remind you all that we're very concerned about a number of issues being supported by the budget. The first one would be whatever response the board is going to come up with to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario Right to Read report, which is coming out momentarily. I gather I've had a chance to look at some of it, and believe me, there are all kinds of implications there for money that's going to be needed. And we're very much in favor of the idea of early identification and intervention. So that's one big theme for us. Another big theme, again, no surprise from me, is the whole issue of de-streaming and the kinds of supports that are going to be required for sure. Not simply in mathematics, which for me is one of the major concerns, but also many other aspects of the de-streaming for the children that our organization is advocating for. And the third one, again, no surprise, is the idea of specific funding for professional development for teachers with Tier 1 evidence-based classroom interventions. Teachers are not comfortable with those. They haven't had the opportunity. And again, I understand that's because there are no release hours available for them because of the lack of substitute teachers. But nonetheless, the whole system is based on good Tier 1 interventions. And if the staff don't get the kind of professional development that they need to be confident with those, then the whole system is going to collapse a little bit like a house of cards, and there's going to be more and more pressure put on to hire more and more professionals to clean up the mess. So that is another one of ours. So those would be our three from the LDA.
Thank you, Maggie. Do we have others that want to add their perspective at this time? Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay. Thank you, Stacey. So it says OSSTF. Oh, but I'm also an ASDP teacher. And for the first time last week, an OT came to visit the students in our unit. So I would advocate for possibly more funds for the professional services that support our children, our students, students, and those OTs and the PTs and all those professional services, the speech language pathologist. And that would be my comment from the front lines. Thank you.
I wonder also, So we've heard a couple of things around teaching assistants and additional PSSP people for ASD classrooms and those kinds of things. I wonder if there's any reactions to any of those. If you don't have any, so what we're trying to do is trying to come up with some key priorities, given that we can't do it all. But what are the key priorities? So if you have a comment or a reflection on anything that's been said, we'd love to take that in.
Kim, please go ahead.
I'll speak to that. Thank you, Peter. And thank you to Ms. Bisley. I also came from the States and understand the teaching assistant, the benefit of having that in a classroom. So just to sort of, that was a blast from the past. Thank you. I would say that I guess from our perspective, there's two things that I can think of that are important. The big one is the recruitment, perhaps revisiting the criteria for EAs in terms of the practical hiring process and retaining them because of the systems that are in place. So a review of that from an HR perspective might make it easier to get people in to help in the classrooms, because it is absolutely, they're just unfilled all the time. And I know you all know that. But there are so many kids that need that kind of attention and find that that is the one way that they can learn. So I will definitely reinforce that that's something to look at. The second thing I would say is early intervention and diagnostics for the ELLs that are streaming into the district, because what we're finding from our perspective and secondary level is that you have secondary age students who have really never attended school, and we know that there are issues of language, but also certainly of special needs. And those special needs kids do not get that. They do not get the diagnostics that they need in any kind of timely way. So we have a plethora of 19, 20, 21-year-olds that are going into the adult world without being diagnosed. So that's my 2 cents on that one. It would be nice to have a system that could create earlier diagnostics and intervention. So that's my little wish list.
Thanks, Kim. And just to be clear, you're representing?
Secondary administrators.
Thank you, as a part of the SEAC. And my question for clarification was going to be around when you talked about the EA situation, are you actually talking about qualifications, like revisiting minimum qualifications?
I am, yes, because I think there are many experienced parents who could be trained with some onboarding to support classrooms.
Jennifer.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I just wanted to reiterate several of the things that have already been spoken, because those are, of course, would be the concerns that we're hearing from elementary teachers. But I wanted to ask Christine a little bit more about the education, the teaching assistants. I mean, I'm thinking that's not akin to our educational assistants. This would be something different. Can you speak to that?
So my understanding is in this board, we are only using EAs as for health needs or behavioral needs. And so for me and the old model that Kim and I went through, we actually had, and it may not have been anybody with any special training, but it may have been somebody that was in first year of teaching, or it may have been just somebody, depending on the age, who had maybe like an ECE, but I'm not going to put a label on it because I think that's more people that actually know what they're doing. I'm not a an education person. But these were people that, for instance, if a child was having difficulty with the concept of addition in grade 1, maybe that's not where it's taught, but addition in grade 1, this teaching assistant could actually take the child aside, and if the particular classroom was using things like manipulatives, and that really wasn't gelling for the child, they could take the child or a couple of children aside in the classroom or out in the hallway and show them again multiple times how you use those manipulatives, how to do that. Same thing with, like, I was a child who had difficulty understanding some consonants that went together and how you pronounce them. And I can remember in grade 2 or 3, for weeks at a time, somebody's mom, who was a friend of mine, took me out into the hallway, once or twice a week for 15 minutes and taught me how to say sandwich, not sandwich, and things like that. So, I mean, that's a really kind of simplistic form of it, but that's what I'm thinking, because once we identify, and it probably does need to be a teacher who can identify what the academic gaps are, as Kim was saying, maybe there are retired teachers, moms or dads that were retired that can help with things like, the speech, manipulatives, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Christine. So I would say that's an excellent idea. And Christine, when I began teaching, that's what an EA did in my classroom. That's what they did, but they don't do that anymore because they're running from class to class. When the admin calls, there's an emergency here, there's an emergency here, and off they go. And anyways, so I would reiterate, teachers would love to have, and I understand where you're saying a temporary influx. This has been an incredible 2-year loss and gap. Teachers are feeling it. They are, they just wrote report cards. They're just saying, this is what the curriculum demanded. This is what the standard is. But how can I even assess it with what's been going on? And they're so far behind already in the gaps, and it just distresses them. I mean, if they could have an influx for a year or two, having an educational assistant in there who is specifically tied to helping with these gaps, that'd be fabulous. I mean, that's a dream. That would be fabulous. And then, so EAs, and then again, EAs, because of course, we're hearing as well from teachers that many students have regressed in their social emotional states, and that they want support for the kids in those areas. They just, they need it. And so how can we get either EAs or social emotional help and retain them so they'll stay and help? What does that look like as far as budget? Thank
you very much, Jennifer. And I know everyone else rejoined our group. I don't think our group saw the broadcast message when I said we have about 2 minutes left. So now I believe everybody is back. So apologies for that, but important for people to have a chance to finish. And as we promised, we'd now like to bring back the common themes that emerged in the various groups. So I'm going to start with Stacy, if you want to just provide a quick summary of the significant themes that emerged in our conversation.
Thank you, Peter. So there was definitely a high degree of consensus amongst our group. So the themes were easy to emerge. So certainly a recognition that there have been significant disruptions over the past 2 years. And that certainly there is a need for budget to reflect that particularly our teachers need the ability to identify and close gaps for students in their classrooms that have been particularly impacted by the effects of the pandemic. And there certainly was discussion that even if these were of a shorter term nature, to address the concerns that they are seeing in their class with the corresponding impacts on students' mental health. Certainly, many who are a part of the SEAC table have heard for the last number of years about the right to read inquiry. And we are expecting that final report in the coming weeks or months. And certainly recognition that as a district, if we are to implement some of the recommendations from that inquiry, particularly in the area of early identification and intervention, that support is required in that area, with special recognition of Tier 1 professional development supports for our staff. There was also talk about the professional support services and things like occupational therapy, physiotherapy, speech language pathology required for many of our most vulnerable learners, and the fact that there has been impact on the availability of those services over the last 2 years. There was also finally that last point is certainly the huge demand for educational assistants and all of the various roles that they play within our system. And as Mike addressed at the beginning of our budget discussion, it's increasingly being more and more difficult to both recruit and retain our educational assistants. So looking at the ways that we both welcome those staff into our district and how we support them to stay with us, and some of the budgetary impacts that would be required to get those types of supports up and running.
Thank you for that, Stacey. We'll go to Amy next.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, everyone. So in our group, there were many common themes as well that surfaced in the conversation, and I'll try to highlight them all as best as possible. So there was sort of a conversation, and one of the key common themes was around recruitment, retainment of staffing. So acknowledging that some of our models are, from around itinerant staff and those types of things are a preferred model, but how to plan for recruiting them, how to plan for retaining them, and after retirement, what are our solutions when we are potentially having some challenges finding them in the workforce. And that kind of bled into a lot of different areas. And it talked a little bit around wages that have happened over the years, competitiveness between our district and other local districts and how they pay different employee groups, and how that is a factor potentially in how we are able to retain individuals, and acknowledging that that could be part of the reason why we are facing shortages for different employee groups in the OCDSB. We talked a lot about the need for evaluation and funding of evaluation as it relates to special education services. And let's use, for example, very specifically, the IEP was raised, and how we could be looking at how that's monitored, implemented, effectiveness, how students are being served in the different tiers if they have an IEP, but also funding and funds set aside for looking at that in particular, but then really honing teacher practice, building those resources, allowing teachers to have access to those resources to really serve all exceptionalities that are before them in the classroom. And that was echoed by a few different memberships and associations. So it wasn't specific to one, but it applied to many. And that our teachers have a lot to serve, and that there are a lot of things that we need to be supporting them and knowing how to do. I'm just scrolling really quickly here. I think those are generally the themes that I've covered. And if there's anyone from my group, please jump in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. And Maggie has added, the de-streaming and math from our conversation at the beginning I think we were the unassigned group. So that did emerge. And of course, we had a discussion on that in December, I believe, and further discussions yet to come. Just a highlighting for folks that in the end, after the next group, if you do have comments or you're making connections, we'd love to hear them at that time. Kate?
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here as always. So we had some similar themes that came up and some ones that haven't been mentioned yet. So I'll focus on, we did speak a little bit about transition planning, specifically for students who might not be on a pathway for college or university. And that added to, we continued to talk about from that theme, the need for integration with our community agencies and further partnership and how we can look for potential partnerships there. We also spoke about the need around resources to support students and moving kind of from a COVID lens into the now, the feeling of needing for some recovery and the focus on de-streaming that's coming and the right to read implications that we know are coming as well. There was a theme around better connection with parents and how we can facilitate and help to inform parents and engage parents early on so that there's a lot more understanding in the parental community about pathways their children and their students are on. And lastly, of course, there was a conversation as well about that retention of staff and succession planning and how we can best be preparing not only the people currently in our system, but looking for those who will be moving into our system to help support.
Thank you very much, Kate, and to that's everybody, right? We had the three groups. Thank you. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and helping to shape some of the themes that are emerging in our current situation. I'm wondering, does anyone else have comments or making connections? Any other committee members? Anything else that they want to share as we shift here? I do see a couple of comments in the chat, which I don't think are available for people who are streaming, but discussions about LRT to assist with learning gaps and sorry, having a hard time scrolling. Social workers, because I'm going the wrong way, sorry about that. Increase in social workers, guidance counselors, so some consideration around those things as well. But happy to hear if anyone has anything. We have a couple of minutes before we wrap this up. If there's anything else to share, I will ask our recorders to make sure that you share the notes with Lee so that they can be captured in the SEAC minutes moving forward. And seeing no questions, any questions or comments from our finance team? CFO Carson or
well, I appreciate the suggestions, and I just want to say, while the final schedule for the budget has not been finalized, there will be a meeting of the committee of the whole budget somewhere in the first week of March, I believe it is. And that will give you an idea of the outline of where things are going. Right now, based on our guesses, assumptions about when the ministry will provide information, is that the board budget itself will be presented towards the end of May. Certainly, we've appreciated this opportunity. Chair, if there are other questions or concerns that come up through SEAC, as always, if you let Peter and I know, we can find time to talk to you about that as further information becomes available. And really, I just want to thank Terry for pulling the information together that we had, and thank you folks for the opportunities to hear directly from you this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And I forgot to mention during my comments, you won't see it if I hold it up because it disappears with the background, but we did receive folks will be familiar, some of you, if you've been around, about the group PAC on SEAC, which is the Provincial Parent Associations of Advisory Committee. So they do some things to support SEACs. They prepare some materials and resources. So they have now released their SEAC resource guide on special education funding. And I will ask Lee to distribute that later on after the meeting, so that folks can take a look through and see some of the things that that group has identified, and some of the comments that they make around some of the funding envelopes and so on, just so you have that for your own reference moving forward. And finally, I would also like to echo Mike's comments around thanking you for your frankness and sharing of perspectives. And we will take that back and reflect moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you again, Mike, for coming this evening and taking the time to provide us with the information, and for Ciac to do the breakout room and to have our discussions. And before we do go on our break, I just wanted to connect and chime in with, I can totally relate with what Kim had said, Trustee Boothby and Jennifer, about the EAs or teacher's assistants, because that's exactly what I used to do as an EA, was work with the students in groups, in classrooms, and it made a huge difference to our students. So I can totally relate with that. And once again, thank you everybody for the opportunity to go into our breakout room, because I do know that our staff really appreciate the feedback that we provide them when we come back into it. And thank you again, Michael, for coming.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
And at this time, I'm going to call a break for 10 minutes. And then when I do come back, I'm just going to ask for my voting members to put on your cameras so I know that you're here and that we have quorum. See everybody in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. If possible, could you turn on your camera and show me your show of hands of my voting members? Hi, Jim. Maggie. Hi, Trustee Campbell. Trustee Boothby. I have quorum. And we're good to start. Hi, Peter. I'm just looking at Peter to see if he's ready. He looks
Yeah,
frozen.
No,
in the
I'm
camera.
just getting devices
Hi,
ready
Peter.
and we're ready to go. Thank you
The
very much,
color's
Sonia.
making you frozen. So at this time, it's you're on the floor to present the memo on the PPM 81 consultation.
Right. So I highlighted this at the beginning. As you know, we've talked before about the Ministries of Health, Child, Community and Social Services, and Education, providing an update or engaging in an update around PPM 81, which is the provision of health supports in school settings. I believe I was in high school when the PPM first came out, so it is in need of an update. And we have also had information come from the association, I'll get the acronym wrong, but Association of Chiefs of Speech and Language Pathology of Ontario have come forward. We looked at that request from the Speech and Language Pathology Association, School Speech and Language Pathology Association last month, and Ciac did decide to write a letter, which Sonia did. That is provided for you. It has been sent to the other SEACs. It's provided to you at 6.1b, which is, so you have that for your reference and part of the work that Ciac engaged in last month. Last week or so, I received a memo from the Ministry of Education inviting us to provide our consultation, our feedback as it relates to the draft consultation plan. In that memo, it did indicate that where possible, we were to include feedback from families and caregivers. So I had emailed to the ministry and I asked if we are, I need clarification on this confidential draft that you've provided to me and how I'm supposed to gather feedback. Can you please, may I share this with Ciac? So then we got permission a couple of days afterwards to share with Ciac, and we had to provide, and we've provided a memo to you highlighting that this is our opportunity to provide feedback. Staff have been invited to participate in a focus group, I believe on the 7th of February, somewhere around there anyway. And school districts have been invited to submit written feedback. I'll be attending the focus groups, but unclear or uncertain how free-flowing it will be in terms of providing our feedback. So we are also going to provide written feedback from our perspective, and we would like to include feedback from Ciac's perspective if there are any. In the package, you do have the draft, or I guess the draft for consultation purposes of PPM 81. There are some dramatic differences that we've noted, and we're still going through this, taking a look at what the considerations are and what they might be, what the implications might be for us as a district. So for example, on page 3 of the PPM, draft PPM, if we look at the delivery of health services in schools, the first one that jumps out at me is the injection of medication. Injections are a controlled act, and to date, apart from EpiPens, the district has not district staff do not provide injections. But if you look under the administration of this, it talks about the student parent caregiver is authorized, health professional, and school board personnel as delegated by health professional. So we're taking a look at that and thinking, well, what are the implications of that if that remains in the final PPM? Another area, for example, in school-based, in the provision of health services is around feeding tubes and G-tube feeding, which are currently done by a nurse. But some indication that that may shift if the draft PPM remains current. So those are kind of the things that we highlighted and that we're talking about. What are the implications for us as a group? For example, we don't currently have a job class that does injections. We don't have the training. We don't have a job class that has the training to provide injections. So it is an area of concern for us. But we also don't know if that means, for example, CHEO is our provider. Maybe it's CHEO staff who are trained to come in, not nurses, but maybe it's other CHEO trained staff who come in and provide those kinds of services so students can access curriculum. So it depends on how it pans out, and we want to highlight some of the concerns from a staff perspective. The other piece that jumps out at us is around the school-based rehabilitation services, and new to the PPM are specific references, for example, to the Ontario Autism Program. The committee will recall that from time to time, I've brought forward updates as it relates to the Ontario Autism Program and some of the shifts that are occurring. But it talks about providing therapy, essentially, and that might be my word. It may not be, it may not appear in here, but certainly allowing the services that are included in the Ontario Autism Program to occur in schools. So, for example, you'll recall years and years ago, we were successful in receiving pilot funding for the Dedicated Space Project, or pilot, at First Avenue. And that is a pilot that has continued to run for a number of years now and continues to run today, where we received funding to retrofit a class to allow community-based providers to come into the school to be able to provide therapy to students in the school that they attend. And now we see this shifting a little bit more in terms of being included in the PPM. So what I would like to do, and I'm not sure the best way to do this, we could go back out into breakout rooms, but we can also have a discussion here. We aren't particularly set up to go into breakout rooms right now for this discussion, I don't believe. But I would love to hear if people have reactions or feedback, or if you've had experiences, what kinds of things you would like to share from a SEAC perspective. We have heard from our speech and language pathologists and the association that represents them. Some of the, and I believe Stacy talked about some of the issues when this first came up around the separation of speech and language services and the responsibility centers, which kind of means if you're a certain age and you have a particular kinds of needs, part of it might be provided by a school board SLP, and part of it might be provided by CHEO, or in those days CCAC, speech and language pathologists. So that kind of separation of services, even though both professionals are equally capable, equally qualified to be a single provider of the support to a student. So that whole notion of getting the support in one spot. So really, we're sitting back doing our thinking around PPM, and would love to hear from the committee, if you have specific things, concerns, or maybe you don't think it goes far enough in some areas. Maybe as a committee, you feel that some of these areas need to go a step further and want to express that. My goal is just to present, here's our feedback to the ministry. And also we did discuss it as a SEAC, and here's some of the things that SEAC shared as areas for consideration. So happy to take any questions, comments. I don't have a lot of answers other than what I've provided to you, but definitely am very keenly interested in hearing from you.
So Peter, we're going to do more or less a discussion and not go into a breakout room. And right now I see that I've got Trustee Ellis, Kathy, and Dr. Maggie. So I'm going to go in that order, and I'll open the floor for discussion and then wrap it up in about 15, 20 minutes. And then as usual, this doesn't end after we finish our discussion. We can bring it up again. But you do have a deadline. I believe you said February the 11th, correct?
The deadline for written submissions is February 11th.
Okay.
There may be other consultations that are going on. For example, the various union groups, I believe, are being connected provincially with this, but definitely want to hear from the members.
Okay, and if you don't get a chance to put your voice out there, definitely email us after. So we're going to go with.
If I may add to that, please email me before the 11th.
Yes.
If
like
you
right
do have
after.
thoughts that emerge after, definitely need that with notice.
Like don't have right after this meeting. So we have Trustee Ellis, Kathy, Dr. Maggie, and Trustee Boothby. Go ahead, Trustee Ellis.
Thank you. Now, the intent here is that there's a seamless delivery of service for students. However, one of the things I'm wondering this, because we're looking at different groups, parents can come and advocate for what they believe their child needs to be successful with teachers, principals in the board. How do they, I'm just wondering how the advocacy of parents to get services for the children will be as robust if we've got all these sharing partners and where they go to. And just my sense is I'd like to get as many of these services in the board's hands. This PPM, I guess, speak to the advocacy, and then to, if I'm understanding this PPM being correct, as trying to identify which organization is going to have the funding to send the delivery, and then they work the other partners. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Trustee Ellis.
So if I can just get a clarification there. So because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when you talk about would like as many of these services in the OCDSB, I think what you're getting at there might be so that the OCDSB has more autonomy over the provision of those services.
Yes, that's correct. And I'm assuming, or I'm hoping, can move quickly in delivering those, identifying and then delivering those services. Obviously, before they come in, we need partnerships, but once they're in the school system.
Thank you, Trustee Ellis. Kathy?
This is far from my area of expertise, but a lot of these things seem to strike me as things that staff at the CB sites would be very interested and would probably impact their lives a lot. So I know your timeline's tight, but I was just hoping that some consultation with them specifically is part of your process. And if not, then hopefully, anyways, that was my main point.
Just on that, Kathy, so I would encourage those staff to make sure that their representatives provincially, as part of their union, are aware of some of their concerns, because there is that consultation piece. I do intend to reach out to the principals to get their perspective.
Like it just, if some communication could be, so that they know where their feedback should go and the timelines and stuff like that, I think that would maybe help, just so that they don't find out about this 2 months later and at that point it's too late or whatever the situation is. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's not just our CB sites also, Kathy. It's also, I know that we have some areas as well in Ottawa Tech and some of our other units for a lot of these services as well. But yeah, thank you.
Good point. Thank you.
Dr. Maggie?
I just have a piece of information I don't know if people are aware of, but the College of Psychologists of Ontario has been required to register the applied behavior analysts. And so the process is in motion for that to happen, which means then they'll be covered under the Regulated Health Professions Act. And as we psychologists know and speech language pathologists know, that sometimes there's a little bit of conflict between what our requirements are under our professional legislation and what the requirements can be under the Education Act. So just to put that in there, just to let you know that that's on the cards, and that will have some implication. I'm not quite sure what, but certainly their scope of practice will be defined, and they'll be expected to work within that. So just a little bit of information, not a question.
Thank you, Maggie. And you're 100% sure it's the ABA professionals?
The applied behavior analysts. Yep.
Not the BCBAs.
Sorry, not the
BCBAs?
No, it's the ABA people.
Thank you for that. I wasn't aware.
It's causing a lot of issues within our profession because we register usually people with graduate degrees. And now we have to look at qualifications across a wide range of backgrounds, and it's a bit of a nightmare, actually. So we're not that happy with the decision, but it didn't come from us.
Dr. Maggie. Trustee Boothby?
Thank you. So my biggest concerns are one Peter has talked about, and it seems like there's a lot of assumptions made in here that we already have the capacity for some of these new things that we're being asked to do, or that we even really want to be doing them. So I think that's a good point that you have, Peter, that you're looking at those things. The other big concern I have is the dollars need to follow the child. And the way this is written, it's very concerning to me that nobody, none of these agencies and us, the school board, certainly do not want to give up any of the funding that we're doing, because we're not going to end up doing less than we are right now. So it needs to be really a lot more transparent here where the funding's going. It needs to be following the child. And I almost think there needs to be some kind of a central table set up like there was at that initiative 4 or 5 years ago that never really got off the ground. But there's a lot of assumptions made in here that everybody's going to play nice and everybody's going to make sure that the funding and whatever goes to kids, and that's not going to happen. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to be trying to protect their turf, their funding, and I mean, everybody's trying to do more with less. And as I read this document, there's a lot of that comes out to me. It's too wishy-washy about who's the lead. Is the money actually going to be following the child? Are they just going to say, guess what? You have 5 more things that you get to do now, but oh, by the way, there's no more money. So that's my biggest concerns. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. And I think you're talking about the special needs strategy.
I think that's what it was called. I can never remember. And we used to talk about it a lot, but it seems to have gone somewhere into the no man's land.
Thank you, Trustee Boothby. So we have Connie, and then after Nancy, I'm going to be asking to forward your concerns and questions to Peter. Go ahead, Connie.
Thanks. I just wanted to highlight that I sent a follow-up email earlier. I didn't receive the OSLA document until this morning, so I apologize for sharing that so late, and the timelines are short. But it does provide some of the answers to questions that were raised by Trustee Campbell last month when we were discussing the letter that was sent out by Ciac. And I just want to highlight that while this memo speaks to unifying services, it doesn't really achieve that in any way, shape, or form. It talks about each child perhaps receiving combined speech and language services from a single therapist, but it doesn't say who that therapist would be. It leaves that in the hands of the board to work out. And I know that management in our system would try to work that out in a way that makes sense. But I think we have to think about our system needs. We have multidisciplinary teams. We have students moving between programs within our boards. If we have community partners coming into our schools, who sets the standard of service? Who decides which community partners deliver services within our school? Who are they responsible to? And for each staff member and student, or if each student is receiving supports from a community partner, and it might be different community partners for students within a classroom, how is the educator taking input from those community partners? So there's a lot of logistical issues in this. And there's a lot of issues around sort of standards of service, consistency of service, organizing services, providing space for services, and some of that would fall to principals. We already have an extreme shortage of space in our schools. It even makes mention of schools having scheduling mechanisms for people coming into the school. So I think that's something that should be highlighted to principals. Because I think that would be quite a difficult and time-consuming task. And I think the single biggest concern that we have is equity. If families are able to purchase services and bring them into schools, services that are already advantaged, or schools that are already advantaged and families that are already advantaged have already access services in the preschool years, families that can access services privately are going to want to access and organize services for their students, for their children at school. And families that aren't able to, the dog always barks at the wrong time. Families that aren't able to access those services are not going to be able to bring those services into the school. The rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer. And it goes against so many things that are that we talked about in the letter last month, and that are also in our board strategic plan in terms of trying to provide equal service for the various communities that we serve. It's also going to be it does nothing to simplify services to make service navigation easier for families. So I think there's huge concerns with the direction set out in this memo, and they don't achieve their own stated goals. In fact, they're working in the opposite direction to create more silos, more fragmentation, more administrative burden, and less direct services for the kids that need it. So that's my piece as a speech language pathologist providing these services in our board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie.
Thanks, Connie. And we have also identified the space issues. We talk about it quite often with Ciac, where we are looking at specialized program classes, and there are schools that we can't get into because they're above occupancy with numbers of students. And that scheduling piece did emerge with the dedicated space at First Avenue. We were able to, part of that agreement was an ABA coordinator who handles that scheduling on behalf of the school and works with the providers around scheduling. So definitely things that we had identified as well. I'm curious, can you elaborate? You mentioned service navigation potentially being more complicated. Could you just go over that one more time for me?
Okay, so services are already very complicated to explain under the current PPM, not the draft that we're currently discussing. They're very complicated to explain to both staff and families, and even to the people at this table, in terms of why does your child receive speech therapy on an individual basis through the health-funded SBRS service, and why do our other students serve through the tier model by an education-funded school board employed speech pathologist? There's a few people at this table that could answer that question, but there's a whole lot that couldn't. And that's how the system currently stands. There's a difference in when students are seen in the preschool setting, their speech, language, stuttering, fluency needs are all met in that preschool setting by one therapist. When they're transferred to the board setting, they might be transferred to two therapists, one to deal with speech and another to deal with language. This memo, while it says they want to unite those services, which absolutely makes sense and all of us would strive for, it doesn't make sense for to unite the services but have to negotiate on an individual basis who is the agency providing that one service for the child. Is that agency SBRS coming into the school for kids of a certain age? Is that agency our board for certain programs? Is that agency private practitioners purchased by parents coming in and providing a two-tiered level of service? So there's a whole working out what it's going to look like. And I know Stacy was very involved in that in the past and in the special needs service. And I know that our senior management, this is going to be a big task for them. So there's the working out how it's going to be. And then one of the things in this memo is that the ministry asks for clear communication to parents around the roles and responsibilities. And this issue isn't a communication problem. It's a systemic problem. It's that the system and the organization of the system has never made any sense. It's never been cost effective. It's never been cohesive. It's never had smooth transitions. It's always had a heavy paperwork burden. And they're not changing any of that. They're asking us to communicate clearly about it while making all of that more complex. This memo, while most speech language pathologists in the province have been eagerly awaiting a change in direction, this is not the change in direction that we were hoping for. This is not going to improve services for students or for families in terms of knowing the service their child's going to receive, who's responsible for it, what it consists of, how long the waiting list is, when it will start, and how long it will last. Does that answer your question, Peter?
It does. I appreciate that, particularly around the piece around we could have multiple providers all coming in at the same time, which results in parents seeing a private therapist, or one parent seeing their child seeing a private therapist, another one an OCDSB employee, and so on. So thank you. I appreciate
I guess
that.
If I could further add to that, it talks about all these service providers working at all three tiers. So I provide full classroom services, small group services, and individual services. Is someone else going to provide a full classroom service? What if there are two private therapists? One, whose parent and the parents of children who want both of those people to provide full classroom services? Logistically, in terms of oversight, this is going to be very, very difficult. And also in terms of, you talk about having an ABA coordinator for the First Avenue site. We're talking about 140 schools and parents who may or may not be accessing these services. And then think about that in terms of who is the main interventionist for a student who may or may not be responsible to our board. And that person has to come to a multi-D and work on an IEP and work within the structures of education. And they don't have the understanding of the ins and outs and the legalities. And we also might not have consent to talk to them. Although again, the memo talks about finding a way to do that. It just speaks, it says that all of these things need to be done and to have at it. But really what happens is the system needs to change so that things are much more seamless. This does not create a seamless, transparent system.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And just when you talk about everything that needs to be done, they're looking for a September 2022 implementation, and it's February. So thank you. I appreciate that.
We have Nancy who has a question or comment as well.
More a comment, and I think it adds, I hope, to what Connie is talking about. As an elementary school principal, we love when community partners come in and provide services to our students. Any services are always valued. We want to be there to support and help all these things happening. One of the challenges when you have many different community agencies and partners working with students is, I'll call it, fragmentation of relationships. Those key relationships that service providers have with students and with the teachers of the students and with the multi-D team and with the parent over time create the intervention for children that will be the game changers. And when we have, and through nobody's fault, many of us have lived the experience of community providers that have gone through a tremendous turnover in staff in recent years, where every time they come in our building or reach out to us or reach out to teachers consulting, it feels like we're right back to step number one again with them. And so one of my concerns in reading through the draft is if there's not a clear delineation about how service is being fragmented between many different partner groups, including the school, how are we going to provide that consistency of relationships over time for children if it's not going to be more school-based again? And so I would ask that there be some consideration of creating those long-term key relationships for students, for their service providers as the users of those services.
Thank you, Nancy. Peter, Maya just wants to be able to provide a little bit of feedback before we move on. Thank you. Go ahead, Maya.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to what Connie was saying. Connie beautifully summarized some of the SLP related issues. Just to add to that, this revision assumes that the clinical model would fit into the educational framework. And fundamentally, there's a big difference between clinical model of service delivery and educational framework, where we strive for equity. Connie already made that point. But it just really becomes tricky to ensure that tiered approach to intervention and universal design for learning, all those fundamental pieces, that we are in alignment as school board SLPs within the framework of learning for all. This is written in with a clinical set of eyes and doesn't necessarily consider the educational framework, which makes it challenging to coordinate. And Connie mentioned the report that she shared with you from OSLA. That's the Provincial Organization for Speech and Language Pathology and Audiology. There's also a national organization, Speech and Language Pathology and Audiology Canada, that provided a position statement that beautifully incorporated the position statement on school-based speech and language pathology services in school settings. And it's an association for Canada representing SLPs from all of the sectors, including private, not just school boards. And it really supports the educational model of speech language pathology delivery, reflecting tiered approach and UDL being effective to support students in school settings. And it really talks about the curriculum-based and collaborative process that's functional and inclusive, and the importance of that model is in a school setting. And it also highlights how the setting in which these services are provided really matters. So it makes me a little bit uncomfortable that, given the best practice that's out there and supported by professional organizations provincially and nationally are not necessarily reflected in this revision. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Peter? He's writing your notes. So, okay, as I've mentioned before, thank you very, very much for the feedback and the conversations that we've had in our discussion. As the meeting goes along and you have thoughts that come forward, jot them down and email them right away to Peter so that you don't forget them. This is very important. And Peter has a crunch time, but he'll do a great job to have this all put together.
I do appreciate that. There is a form also to submit the written feedback, but I'm going to figure out how to make it work so that we can provide not only staff's perspective on things, but also the perspective of Ciac. So I really appreciate everyone's input and thinking on it and flagging some things for that are now staff issues as well.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Moving on to our number 7 department update. It's back to you, Peter, with your report.
It is just trying to manage the devices and paper. So yes, thank you very much for that, Sonia. A couple of things to update. You'll recall in June, I believe, we introduced Emily Bala as our interim mental health lead. Very excited that competition is now completed, and would like to offer our sincere congratulations to Emily as now our official mental health lead. Certainly, we know Emily chose to take on this role at a time where a lot of things were going on, a lot of balls up in the air, and certainly she's gotten up to speed quickly and has been making a wonderful contribution to our supports and services for kids and helping with the mental health well-being and promotion and prevention work that we need to engage in to help students succeed. Also very excited. I don't think I mentioned it last month, and that's my mistake. But our supervisor of social work, Catherine Langevin, has retired at the earlier this week. So I apologize if I forgot to mention that, but Catherine had a long career both as a social worker and as our supervisor of social work, leading that department, and made a huge contribution. And of course, the leadership team benefited from her ongoing feedback and support as we work on developing strategies and approaches to improving our supports for students from a social work lens. So definitely appreciate her. Apologies for not sharing that in our last meeting, but we also have run a competition for that position, and very pleased to announce Emily Locke as the successful candidate as the supervisor of social work. So Emily has a wide variety of practices, most recently as a social worker in our own district, a wide variety of experiences, most recently as a social worker in our own district, but definitely really looking forward to having her come on board. I don't know if Emily Locke is here tonight, but we will have an opportunity. I don't see her on my screen right now, but we will have an opportunity to hear from her as we continue our presentations on the various roles of folks within the Learning Support Services Department, as we've done with psychology and speech and language pathology and so on. So we will get an opportunity to meet her, and she is currently getting up to speed on her new role as supervisor. So please join me in congratulating her as well. And we will get to meet her imminently. I did share the pack on Ciac regarding finances, and that will be coming out. And we've heard a couple of times tonight, the right to read inquiry. That we are anticipating is coming out this month. We have heard that it is a pretty extensive document. I think that was shared here. And we are anticipating comments, suggestions, and recommendations relating to their 5 benchmarks of universal design for learning, mandatory early screening, reading intervention programs, effective accommodation, and psychoeducational assessments. So we are anticipating that that will definitely give us some opportunity to reflect on things and our approach. Notwithstanding that, we have been working in the absence of the report and recommendations. You'll recall that it is, excuse me for 1 second. Sorry about that. You'll recall that it has been delayed a couple of times. We have begun as a district and a very strong partnership with our partners in program and learning, taking a look at effective literacy instruction in particular, and ways that we are working to support students, especially as it relates to reading in this particular context of the right to read inquiry. So that should be coming out soon. Again, depending on when it comes out, we may be in a position to have some highlights shared by March. But in order for us to meet our timelines, it needs to come out sooner than later. And as of this point, we haven't received it. So regardless, March, April, assuming it is released, we will be bringing that forward to Ciac for discussion feedback. And I would imagine that it will continue to emerge as we move forward and we come to deeper understandings about what some of the recommendations are. And certainly the ministry will have some input as well, Ministry of Education in that regard. You will all be aware by now, but we have returned to in-person learning after we had a brief stint in remote learning, a shift to remote. So that's good news. We continue to monitor the landscape as it relates to COVID. It was highlighted earlier by CFO Carson around our challenges with replacing staff. Certainly with our challenges with the shift in direction around isolation and the requirements on staff to isolate, we are seeing impacts. And we have had to make the decision in a few circumstances to close schools. We continue to struggle also with finding qualified replacement staff, whether they be teachers or educational assistants. And I would just like to reiterate the CFO's comment around the labor shortage as a whole, because we do in fact have some struggles staffing positions that are full-time. So we're working with human resources on an ongoing basis. But I know we work very closely with school principals, and we hear quite often that they're struggling, and often the principals have to act in those roles in order to ensure the smooth operation of a school as much as possible. So school principals really are being taxed in that regard, as are all school staff when we have to redeploy or reassign staff within a school. All of those things are going on as we work to try to support situations where we're not able to access staff. So that brings me to an end for my superintendent's report. Before we move on to the report that's before you, are there any questions for me? Not seeing any. So you do have in your package report 22-019 on integrated transition planning. If you've been around for a while, you will recall that a few years ago, we had many discussions around what transition supports are in place for students who are not necessarily going on to a college or university pathway. What about those students who are staying with us to 21 and are heading off into different areas? And what are we doing to support families and students in managing those transitions. One of the things with the support of SEAC that we did advocate for was an increase to our secondary learning support consultant positions, specifically oriented towards helping us get a deeper understanding of transitions for students who are with us to 21 in particular. And then we were hit with the pandemic, and that was kind of put on hold a bit. We talked about doing collaborative work with our coterminous board, but for obvious reasons, we weren't able to move that forward. However, beginning this fall, we did start to get into things a little bit deeper, thinking about some of the concerns that families have brought forward to us in those meetings years ago. So, for example, we heard giving the information to us at 1920 is way too late. We need to start much earlier. I've heard stories of people who have incredible capacity within their own family units. And I've heard stories from those families who struggle to manage, to understand processes and how to mobilize supports for their students, adults who are heading into post-21. So with that in mind, we started to think about some things with these complex learners. What are some things we want to offer as a support to our families to help make that transition more seamless, more timely, so that it's not coming up at the very end and our families are in a pretty rough position of saying, wow, I should have begun that 4 or 5 years ago. So under the direction of System Principal Stout, she and her team, and I'll let her introduce her team who are with us tonight, have been working on trying to create some documents that might help support some families who are in this situation. And we will be eliciting feedback as we continue on through this work. It is an area that we are going to continue to work on, but this is one area that we've been able to start with. So I will turn it over to Kate to take us through a high-level approach to what we have in our package.
Thanks so much, Peter. And I am really excited to have Stephanie King and Vicki Holen here with us tonight. They're two of our secondary LSCs, and they've been certainly leading me through this information as we start to put together a little bit more of a cohesive approach to how we're going to support students who are on a pathway that may not be college and university, and certainly those who stay with us to the age of 21. So you do have the package in front of you. I'll highlight a couple of things for you as we go through it, and then we'll take some feedback or comments if you have any. I'll start by saying that with Stephanie and Vicki, we did some work speaking with teachers and educators, educator teams, to try to gather some information about what they need, how we can best support them when supporting students in this role, on their pathway. And we certainly, our goal will be to connect with families and other members of the community at large to try to continue to move this forward. We have spoken obviously with the senior team as well as with some of our multidisciplinary members to get some of their feedback on some of the items in front of you this evening. I'll draw your attention to kind of the 3-phase plan that we've outlined here. And so phase 1 really being that information gathering and developing a checklist that we are hopeful will be helpful to parents as well as to school-based teams, and helping to guide families through their planning of their pathway where their student is headed. So phase 1 is that kind of information gathering. Phase 2 is certainly around the information sharing. We're looking forward to getting our checklists out into the hands of educators and families. We are hopeful to get it up on the website so it's easily accessed. The checklist is intended to be used online. It is hyperlinked so that the links to different agencies are readily available, and but also acknowledging that these pieces of information change quickly. And so we want to really make sure we're being as thoughtful as we can to ensure those links are up to date and taking people to the most accurate information as possible. And then the other part of the information sharing is that we're working with communications to launch a few workshops for families coming up in the next month or so. We have in your package some proposed presentations that we're hoping to bring together some community agencies to provide a bit of a virtual symposium, if you will, some key themes that we have heard are essential for families to hear about, and acknowledging this is a launch point, a starting point. If you kind of imagine a few years ago, we would have gathered in a bit of a more of a fair type setting where we would have invited all of these agencies to a central setting where families could gather. We're hoping to be a little bit more thoughtful in some of the themes that we're presenting, and hoping to help families navigate the pieces that might work for them a little bit better, acknowledging that there's lots of different pathways that families and students take. And then the third phase is around some of the future planning. And so certainly we have started conversations with a lot of community agencies, and I give full credit to Stephanie and Vicky for their hard work in reaching out to those groups, trying to gather as much information so it's up to date, but also who's best to sit around the table with us. We have sat in discussions with our coterminous board and kind of been excited about what that might look like in the coming years to work together with them and agencies so that it is, again, building that community around families. We really are hopeful that we can empower the students to be voices for themselves, but also for families to have a place to share their stories and how their journey has gone, the struggles that they've had, but also the celebrations that they can bring to the space and share with us. So those are kind of the phases. I encourage you to kind of flip into the checklist in your package. The checklist is broken down into, we have 4 key aspects that we broke it down into. So page 1 is kind of that general overview, outlining for families some key things to think about. The second page is around a bit of an annual checklist, things to think about as you're planning for your child or student. The third page is a checklist by age to really highlight for families the need to start to look into certain aspects of planning for their student child at those particular ages. So as Peter indicated, starting this planning at the age of 19, sometimes people feel like they're now behind in planning. So really trying to highlight for families as early as we can the need to get connected. And then lastly is some contact information for some of those key agency pieces that will help them navigate their way through this planning process. So I think that's what I have to share with you. In the package, there are some guiding questions, but certainly I look to open up the floor to any questions that you may have or suggestions that you may have in looking through the package this evening.
One of the things we did hear, and already our feedback, is that possibly starting at age 15 is too late, and in some areas needing to consider starting earlier. So definitely very interested in hearing the feedback and hoping to make this document as useful as possible to our families, recognizing that it's going to exist in draft form so that we can update as information changes and evolves over time.
Before I go to Trustee Ellis and Catherine Holden, Kate, I'm not sure if our families are aware, but there is, when they hit 18 and they become adults, there is what we call passport fund, and it provides Stephanie's nodding to it. It provides the support so that, at 18, yes, it does sound like it's a little late, but it is funding that is there so that we can get the coach to come in and prepare them for life skills, prepare them for community, like, for example, Carleton Heights has a community center that provides day program. The day programs are shifting to more community-based families, less group home, more one-on-one. So starting at a young age at Wise Owl and moving forward, but they, you know, you have to start at a young age to put their names on this list so that they can move out, because as you said, some cannot go to the college setting, but there are opportunities with this funding to continue the transitioning steps that they are taking to move on into the community along with the coach to have with them. So on that note, we're going to start with Trustee Ellis, and then I have Catherine.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where guidance counselors fit in with this, or perhaps they don't because this is a more specialized transition. If you could just, if I could hear where guidance counselors fit in.
Certainly. So I think it's a great question, and it's certainly one that we are talking about of whose role is it to do what pieces, and it's a big question. We know that it is outlined as part of the Education Act, and certainly in the PPM 140 around transitions. And so specifically, I think in high school settings, guidance counselors, we tend to think of them in that college and university pathway. And I think we're looking to kind of have that open discussion about helping to do some program pathway planning for students who aren't on that pathway. So I would say it does fall under the guidance counselor's role, but I think in certain places, specifically, I'm thinking like at Clifford Bowie and Crystal Bay, where there are not guidance counselors, that's something that we need to really be thoughtful of and who is doing that work.
So then as we move forward, there'll be some capacity building necessary for guidance counselors. And so I hope you fight for that at budget time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Catherine Holden.
Oh, sorry. Hi. So I just have a couple of points. One of the largest barriers I have found when it comes to accessing services and is language and being able to parents being able to work within the French and English language, and that's a tremendous barrier. So I'm wondering if where we are in terms of looking at having this material translated, having maybe some of our MLOs getting some training on this so that they can help support families. And so language is my first question. And secondly, yes, 15 is too late to start this planning process. In fact, it'll be important for us to work as a system so that when students are being assessed in grade 8, grade 6, that type of thing by psychologists, that we're looking also at making sure that some of that documentation might be in place for future applications to DSO for services, because you know, a lot of students aren't reassessed from, well, they're not reassessed from grade 8 to graduation. So a lot of those documents need to be in place when the assessment is done, potentially for the last time.
Thanks, Catherine. So I appreciate the mention of the barriers, particularly around language. We had a preliminary conversation with Shran. She's one of our representatives who in the FACE committee. And so that's a family and community engagement. And we've spoken with her specifically about exactly that, of how can we get this information to the families who are not speaking English or French as their first language. So certainly some great suggestions from her in reaching out to MLOs and getting some contacts as well with community agencies and how we can help to partner with them around sharing the information that we provide and supporting those families in that way. So more to come there, and I agree with you, it's going to be an important next step. And then as for, thank you for the comments around age 15 is too late. I think we certainly see this as the sort of work that needs to happen. It's not just a high school, like starting in high school planning. And so I think as we begin to have the discussions specifically, you know, I'm thinking about children in our specialized program classes who will be moving up that into the high school specialized program classes, that we really are having those cross-panel discussions to make sure we have in place for them what they need. So thank you for the feedback.
Thank you, Catherine. So we will be moving. Oh, yes, Peter.
Just as we always do, I know that some people have connections with associations and what have you, where you might have more students, more children who fall into this category. If you do start to think about some of the feedback you've received, please do reach out and let us know, because it is an area that not a lot of people know much about. We're very fortunate with our learning support consultants with Kate in building that knowledge. But if you have anything, in much the same way as Sonia did with the opportunity for funding, I wasn't aware of that. And I've been doing this a good long time, but not working in this particular field. I noticed our learning support consultants nodded right away when you mentioned it, but it's important that we start to share that information, build our collective capacity so that we're prepared or in a better position to be able to offer that support to students, families, and caregivers.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. Again, if there's any burning thoughts that appear, just forward them to us. I'm sure Peter will appreciate, and the team as well, with any ideas or feedback. And we are going to move on to System Principal Hannah with our standard.
Thanks, and good evening, everybody. So tonight is our sort of, I think, our last time coming together in this formal consultation around the different standards that are before us. There are other standards that we haven't discussed publicly in this manner, because if you recall, we had made the decision as a SEAC that there would be some that would be brought forward for formal review, and the other ones were private reviews that you can share with myself, any feedback or thoughts or suggestions. And we are requesting that we really do invite your comments. So those are welcome to come to us until the end of February. So we're hoping by the end of this month that should you have any feedback for us on any of the standards that we haven't reviewed or consulted with you publicly like this, the other ones that haven't been brought forward, that we look forward to hearing from you then. And then we'll begin our work of reviewing, revising, and updating to bring back to you that later on this spring for your review and approval to move forward to the community of a whole for their approval to go towards the Ministry of Education. So just wanted to outline a little bit of the steps moving forward. The last two that we have tonight, the first one is the standard related to early identification procedures and intervention strategies. And this standard is one that it continues to require some deep dives into. And I will say that tonight we have begun the conversation, and it includes Emily Bala, our mental health lead. It includes Stacey Kay, our manager. It includes our supervisors of social work, of psychology, and of course, speech language pathology, and of course, Kate, because it really has many, many aspects that have to be considered, and it's very multidisciplinary in approach. And I would say that as we look at it as a review piece, some pieces that we're going to be adding are ones that we're also working on with other departments. So really concretely, there's been a lot of different approaches and new expectations within the district this year to support reading intervention. And reading intervention at a very young age has been work that has been co-created, co-authored by some of our learning support consultants, but also a lot of our speech language pathologists have been working closely with the Department of Program and Learning, formerly Curriculum Services, to devise what are these standards? What are the different tools that we should be using to look at those reading intervention strategies? So there will be quite a bit of updating that will need to happen that I don't have all the information to share with you tonight because it is work that is ongoing, but it would be included in the review that will be coming to you in the month of June. And so things of that nature, and also that applies to some of the assessments. So we have been looking this year a little bit differently at what assessment tools we're looking at for early intervention. And there have been some other pieces that have been included, like, for instance, Lexia, which is a platform or program which is now being offered for students to be able to intervene and look at some of those reading skills. And you'll have an opportunity to learn about that in the coming months. I believe it's on the forward agenda. So that's something that you're going to be learning about. So I guess I'm just trying to signal to all of you that I'm sort of launching some things that are going to be coming your way with more information, but also that's going to be part of what we're going to need to communicate. And then generally, there really is an emphasis here on the role of the parent. The role of the parent or guardian and caregiver in many aspects of that early intervention piece, as it relates to information, how we're connecting with families, how we're looking at information and artifacts that they have collected about their child, how we can continue to inform them, how they can continue to inform us at different stages along the way. And I really think that that is language that is not as clear as it needs to be for our parents and guardians in our community to really understand those structures. And not to lob us back into a previous conversation about the rewrite of PPM 81, but really trying to provide a bit more clarity on a flow of how that information can come between different individuals in the best interest of the student. So there is some language in there, but we hope to provide more clarity and provide even perhaps a bit of a chart to look at that information. So the other part that's in there is around our ELL or ELD students. So there is and continues to be many students that are arriving in our district that go through our Family Reception Center. So we also will be embarking once again on updating components of this standard with our partners in our equity, with our equity team who work in the Family Reception Center. They are key authors that have been working with us the last 2 years in this section. So we want to ensure that we're including them as well as the Indigenous education team. So there are many different people that will be contributors to this section, and we have not had the opportunity to work with all of them as of yet, and information continues to evolve. I know Peter just highlighted in his update as well that we still await the right to read report, which I also will be a huge component to what we would need to consider as part of some updates to the work that would be highlighted in the standard as well. So the takeaway is lots of work to still do in the standard. We are continuously always improving annually. We hope to capture, because again, when we share this information, it's what work has happened over the course of this year, 2021, 2022. And so obviously we'll probably need to incorporate as well, probably a section of what have we started and what will we be continuing next year, so people can have a bit of going forward, what to expect moving into the next year. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions on this standard.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, I've got Dr. Maggie.
Just unmute myself. Hi, thanks, Amy. That's interesting. I'm interested in terms of the equity and the English language learners and the fact that a lot of children with learning disabilities have parents with learning disabilities, and possibly parents who don't have great literacy skills, certainly maybe don't speak English. What languages is the kindergarten intake form going to be available in?
That's a great question, Dr. Maggie. So that's something that I can get back to you with. That's a task that's initiated by the team in Program and Learning. And so we have reached out to them actually on that matter, as well as looking at how we can be incorporating some key questions for identifying sort of some special education needs that students may have. So I will get back to you on that one.
Okay, thanks. And there was just an interesting one that asked a question about, on that form, about what events might have happened in the family that could impact a child's learning. And I'm just interested because I think the two examples given were the birth of a sibling or the death of a family member. I'm not sure there are that many people who would connect those events as impacting a child's learning. I think that comes very much from our perspective. You know, we know that that impacts a child's learning, but I'm not sure that, you know, parents would know what to put in. I mean, divorce would be one of the huge ones for me. If a child's parents have divorced, especially when they're in kindergarten or grade 1, their learning is completely disrupted. So I don't know. I mean, it's a good question, but I don't know how maybe we can pull that out a little bit more. I mean, it's a minor point, but I think when we're relying so much on parents, which I think is a great thing because they have a wealth of information, I think we do owe it to them to be pretty clear on the kinds of things we're interested in knowing.
Thank you for that feedback.
Not be obvious to them.
Right. And then so maybe it's looking as well as how those conversations, like how they're actually come together and how they're had between families and schools as well, right? So it's one thing to have the example and to, you know, fill out the form and come prepared to do those things, but also how are we engaging in that conversation and posing the questions of one another in a very respectful way, but one that really looks at serving and better understanding the needs of the student. So
yes. And there are some pretty good structured and semi-structured clinical interviews that you can do. You know, I'm not sure how available they are to and who would be, you know, qualified to do those, but right. You know, if you could do a sort of almost like a broad screening, you know, and then you kind of close the net a little bit more and you look much more for key clinical indicators that there may be something that's impacting the child's learning. So, you know, I think to keep that in mind is, but I'm really happy that this is taking so much attention. You know, it's one of my pet things. So I'm happy with that. Thanks for all the work.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your suggestions. Wonderful. And I've added a note to my file. So thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? No.
Okay. So again, if more surface, please do feel free to reach out to me. The second one under review this evening is the educational and other assessments. So as a component to this standard, it's really that outlining of the different types of professionals that we have that serve our students in the education system and in our district. What are the acts or the professional requirements of these individuals? So you would see that, for instance, under speech language pathologist or psychologist or psych associate, what types of criteria are there and what types of credentials and qualifications are required of those individuals. In this standard as well, we are required to provide information around how do we obtain parental consent, what does that look like, the privacy of information of students, and as well looking at wait times. And so this is actually linked to last month when you had the opportunity to hear from Manager Stacey Kay a little bit about our wait times. And so the information that you would have heard last month, for instance, will be incorporated as we move forward into reworking and reviewing the standard. But at this point, we're looking probably just to do a review and tweak some pieces and add some details that are pertinent to this year, but no sort of deep rewrites of any sort. So please do let us know if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you, Amy. The floor is open. Do we have any questions or comments? Oh, we're good. Thank you very much, Amy. We're going to move on to our committee reports. We don't have anybody for the board. I was at the committee of the whole beginning of January. Feels like it was such a long month. So there was a lot of delegates about safe schools, safe returning, concerns for the little ones, the masks. We had a few doctors that came and spoke about their concerns. The pop-up, I know there's a name for it, pop-up vaccine clinics that was brought up. And then there was also, so the question I had brought up, because it was a concern to me, we heard this again this evening about shortage of staffing, the concerns about creating, being able to support the students. I did ask what would happen to our units, our CV sites, and our classrooms that have host our students with special needs. They are making sure they're doing their best to provide the support and the capacity if closure is the last resort. But for example, if there's a cohort, 2 cohorts have already been exposed together, they will try to put the cohorts together. If they've noticed the classroom typically would have, like I know in an autism unit, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 8 students in the classroom, 8 to 10, I think.
6.
So if you're down to say 3, then they'll use the EA to provide support for the other classroom. So they're making sure in any way possible to keep the classrooms open for our students, because they do need that support. So that was what came out for me at Cal that evening. So, and then moving forward, we have Kathy for Committee of the Whole Budget.
There hasn't been a meeting yet, so.
Okay, and I think Mike said that it'll be in March, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think there was like early March was what I heard, so.
Okay,
keep an eye on the
perfect.
calendar.
Awesome, thank you so much, Kathy. Advisory Committee of Extended Day and Childcare, Terry.
Absolutely nothing heard. Okay,
thank you very much. For your own information, we did add the Special Education Advisory Committee 2020, 2021, I'm going to get that. Acronym list is attached for your information. Under new business, I do have something. It was brought to my attention before our meeting, so I kept it to the end. Our Board of Service, Lee Fenton, is resigning after this evening. She is moving on to a new journey. And it was great sadness that we bid farewell, as this is her last meeting with us this evening. Developed, she's been wonderful, great friendship, and always there to support with any questions, any need we've always had from her. And her smile has always been a joy. So we will miss you a great deal, but you are now an asset for the other path that you're going on. So thank you very much, Lee.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thank everyone here on SEAC, all the members who have been so kind, and I will really miss this committee.
Well, we're going to miss you, so you're going to have to come back and visit. And on that note, I also want to thank everybody for being here tonight and to continue to do the work that you do for our students, because without you, there is, we're there to make sure that they can succeed in society. And for that, I thank you so much. And stay safe. And I was thinking actually today that I look forward to the day where we are back in the rooms. And it's nice to see you, but to actually physically see everybody. And I miss the side chats and the smiles and the in-person. So hopefully that will happen soon. But we still have virtual and we still see each other. And thank you so much for all that you do. Stay safe. Have a good night.